Wisdom. I'm with the vice editor of Era of Wisdom, Brandon Turbeville. He's a writer with activist posts, an author of several books about things like Hillary Clinton and Syria, and he's going to tell us about his attempted trip to Syria, his trip to Lebanon, and what he discovered about that.
Yeah, thanks, Cassius. Several weeks ago, I attempted to take a trip to Syria, and our goal was to make it into Syria and not only act as a peace delegation, meaning we were trying to express opposition to the U.S. involvement in the war against Syria, but we were also attempting, or at least I was attempting, to get on the ground and get a first-hand visual of what was happening on the ground, and of course talk to the Syrian people who were in Syria on the ground. Now, I already talked to Syrian people in Syria. I have sources. I've done interviews. People can see my videos, etc., with those people. But there's also something special about being on the ground in the war zone while it's happening. So that's what I was attempting to do. Unfortunately, there were some logistical issues, and we were never able to get the visas. So I didn't make it into Syria, but I stayed in Lebanon for about 2 weeks. And over the course of the stay, I managed to travel all over the country. And, Lebanon's not that big, so you can do that fairly easily from north to south, east to west, and traveled most of the country. And had a chance to talk to the Lebanese people, obviously, and get a sense of the culture, the politics. But also, there are many Syrians who come over the border from Syria into Lebanon for either business or to visit family, friends, and whatnot. And, of course, Syrian refugees are everywhere in Lebanon. It's right next to Syria. It's right over the border. They poured into Lebanon, especially in places like Beirut, where there's Syrian refugees everywhere. And you get the sense that some of them are doing well, some of them are struggling, and then others are being grossly taken advantage of. So it's a mix, but you get to talk to a number of different people there in Lebanon. But one of the things, before we get to any of your questions, I want to really point out is that the people that we spoke to, these are the most amazing, friendly, kind, forgiving people I have ever met in my entire life as a group. They are fully aware of what the United States is doing to their country. Unlike the United States, which, probably a majority of the population couldn't point to Syria on a map. The Syrian people know full well that the United States has been behind the destabilization from the beginning. They know they're funding ISIS. They know they're funding Al-Qaeda. They know that Saudi Arabia is funding them. They know that Israel is behind it as well. They know all these things. So you would expect, as an American, whenever you come into contact with somebody who has been a victim of that war policy and knows who is behind it, you would expect as an American that you would be treated poorly, or there'd be a lot of anger. They would spit on you. But that is not the case at all. Again, these are some of the kindest, most forgiving people that I have ever met. They first of all separate the American people from the American government. Now, they are disgusted with the American government. They can't stand the American government. But the American people, they welcome with open arms. I was treated so well by these people who didn't have anything, and they all they had was their time, and they gave that generously. They would stop and talk to you. If there was an interpreter, they'd spend all this time talking you through the interpreter. If there wasn't an interpreter, they'd stand there and try to talk through body language, or what little I know of Arabic, what little they know of English, and we try to piece it together. Or Google Translate on the phone or a laptop. We'd type something in a language and hand it to each other, and then type it back. And it was a great experience. But you don't talk to one single person from Syria who hasn't lost someone close to them, and usually in a fairly violent grotesque manner. Not by natural causes. It's by mortars, machine guns, a building collapsing on. I mean, it's usually something violent. It's all. I mean, it's as a result of the war. Yet they still would walk up to me and thank me for what I was doing for their country, and that was hard to fathom, right? Because they're thanking me. I just came over here as an American. I'm not under a war siege like as they are, but yet they are still treating me as if I'm the honorable guest, and that they are really thankful that I'm even there. And we met one guy who simply saw one of our group members had a wristband on, and it had the Syrian flag around a wrist, and he saw it. He just happened to be passing by, and he saw the Syrian flag, and he stopped, and he said, Syria, Syria, and he gave us a thumbs up, and he gave a thumbs up back, and he says, Assad, and he gives us the thumbs up. And so we walk over and talk to him, and he was a great person, and the Syrian people did not deserve what's being dealt upon them, and nobody does, but especially not these people. I think it would be surprising to Americans how, obviously things are different, culture is vastly different, but it's also very similar. There's a lot of similarities, and I think if people got a chance to know them, they might think differently. But unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be the will to get to know them. The other thing is that they have a problem, well, not a problem, but they have a difficulty in understanding why the American people aren't upset. And this was, believe me, very difficult to try to explain, because there's no way to justify it, but to try to explain to somebody why someone else does not care that your family is being killed in front of you, that's a very difficult thing to try to tell them. But they legitimately do not understand how Americans can sit back and do nothing as this is happening. And I was asked many times that question. Why aren't Americans out in the streets? Why aren't you guys, having a revolution over this? And to explain to them that the majority of people don't even know. That's something that they couldn't, hardly fathom, is how do you not know that this is happening, and then how do you not care?
That's incredibly insightful. Man, I appreciate the fact that you went there to firsthand feel their experiences and get from them exactly, how it really is and how it's going on there. How exactly did they ask you that? How did they what did they say exactly?
Well, they would say those words. They would say, why aren't Americans out in the streets? Why aren't they protesting? Why aren't they having a revolution in America? Why are you guys not doing anything? That was the biggest question that they had, was why are, we know your government's bad, but why aren't you guys stopping it? Because they don't judge the American people as being bad. They don't judge, I made a smart aleck comment about Americans not finding Syria on a map. They don't view the American people as being stupid or lazy or supporting war, being bloodthirsty. They don't view America as the American people as that. So they view the American people as being educated, intelligent, like they are, empathy, that they have empathy, that they don't want war any more than the Syrians want war. And we could talk about that, but they don't view Americans for what they really are, right? They don't get the grasp that legitimately most Americans would probably not be able to point to Syria on a map if you gave them the opportunity, or that most Americans actually believe that Bashar al-Assad is bombing hospitals, killing civilians, torturing civilians, they don't understand that most Americans actually believe that. Now, some of the ones who follow closer, who are a little more active and follow closer will understand that, but the average Syrian person we talked to just couldn't get a grasp of why Americans weren't out in the streets by the hundreds of millions demanding that the U.S. stop this. If for no other reason than their own personal interests, but that was something that they didn't seem to be able to grasp. The ones that tend to focus more on the issues did, like the political issues, the geopolitical issues, did tend to know more about that. But the average person couldn't fathom why Americans weren't out there in the streets fighting.
Well, that's incredibly insightful. So, is there anything more you can say to paint exactly how this positive attitude was, and any more examples of things they said or did that illustrate their attitude?
Well, this was, I was, again, thanked so many times for just attempting to go there. And I was treated like a guest of honor, that I had come over just to visit their country, and that I didn't support the war against their country. And it's hard to really put into words the energy behind that, but because it was hard to it was hard to really understand how they could legitimately be so welcoming and so happy to have me there. When I don't think that if Syria was funding, I don't know, Honduran death squads in the United States that had killed hundreds of thousands of people, I don't think for a second that Americans would want to see a Syrian on American soil, and if they had treated me poorly, I would have understood that. I get why somebody would do that, but they didn't. And this was the case with everybody that we talked to from Syria. I didn't come across one who was bitter at me or any of us who were from the West. At the governments, yes, but none of them were bitter at us. It was they totally looked at us as individuals and welcomed us as individuals. There's a lot of personal stories that I heard that I can't repeat just because of out of respect for their privacy. I don't want to put their personal stories out on the internet. But again, everybody's lost somebody, and some of the stories that I heard are just absolutely heartbreaking. What they left. I mean, there are people who literally lost everything in a span of just a couple of hours. They lost their homes, they lost their business. A middle-class family, who lost their business and then had to flee their homes because America's rebels came in and overtook their town. And they fled out of Syria and became refugees living on the streets, all within a span of 2 days.
Wow. And
they were lucky because the terrorists gave them the option to leave, and they weren't so kind with others. This is a typical story.
Wow, that's incredibly insightful, man. So, we know that U.S. drone strikes, that attacks with mortars, I believe, are things that kill innocent people, destroy buildings, and everything in Syria. But, for the sake of, getting every single piece of the story, did anyone have any stories of Russia destroying their buildings, killing innocent people, anything like that? I'm just curious for the sake of getting every side of it, because we know the criminality of the U.S. and all that, but just curious.
There weren't. In fact, I should have mentioned this. This is one of the interesting points too. Is that out of all the Syrians that we spoke to, 100% of them supported their government and supported Bashar al-Assad. There was not a single one of them that had even a shred of legitimacy for the so-called rebels. They love the Russians. I didn't hear anything negative about the Russians. They are very glad that the Russians are there. In terms of the hospitals, one of the things that you'll see, there's this hospital called Al-Kindi Hospital. The Russians were blamed for bombing it and destroying it. The Syrians were blamed for bombing it and destroying it several times over. So this must be one hell of a hospital that can be bombed by the Syrians and the Russians and the Syrians and the Russians and then survive to be bombed yet again. But then we actually have video of the terrorists bombing it, but that's not something that's shown on the mainstream media. The Syrian people, something like that, they will tell you the same thing. They'll say, what about this hospital? They keep saying it's Al-Kindi. That's not the hospital. You know, this thing was destroyed by rebels. But yet here it's portrayed as if Putin and Assad went and bombed this hospital full of innocent people. There are no report. The question of barrel bombs, that's the other thing. The media here will present barrel bombs as if they're some inhumane, well, any bomb is inhumane, but you get the idea that it's some type of torturous device that's designed to maim civilians and everybody else and spread out indiscriminately. A barrel bomb basically functions as the same as any missile. The Syrians just figured out how to do it cheaper, as opposed to spending $850,000 to launch a missile. They can do it for $50,000. So there are barrel bombs, if you want to call them that, being dropped, but they're being dropped on terrorists. And there have been, field hospitals, and by this I mean hospitals that are not registered as being hospitals. So how would anybody know not to bomb it? And they are terrorist-operated medical facilities in terrorist-held territory. And again, a building gets bombed, and then the next day we hear the White Helmets or the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights coming out and saying, "Oh, look, Assad bombed a hospital." Well, who knows that it was a hospital? They're supposed to identify themselves if they're a hospital. There's been no evidence that Assad or the Russians were bombing any hospitals especially where there were civilians remaining. Again, all of the people that we talked to supported Assad 100%, supported the Syrian government 100%. And these were Syrians in Lebanon. So one of the criticisms you get, had I made it to Syria and talked to Syrians, and if I had gotten that same reaction, I would have heard from the media, well, of course they said they supported Assad because they were scared they were going to get tortured if they didn't say it. That's what they would tell me. Well, I talked to Syrians in Lebanon, and Assad isn't in control of Lebanon, and he doesn't have the ability to get to Lebanon, and he certainly doesn't have the resources to waste to follow Syrian refugees around and make sure people don't say bad things about him. These people were under no threat from Assad in Lebanon, yet they all told me the same thing, and it was without question. It was the same story. They loved Assad. They loved the Syrian government. Now, some of them would tell you that they had problems with some of Assad's policies, before this whole war started. But now they're willing to put that on hold. And once they win the war, then they can talk about reforms. And this is totally reasonable. Some of the issues were simple. It wasn't anything that would engender a revolution. It was Assad's reforms aren't coming fast enough, or there's government corruption. These are issues that every government on the face of the earth has issues with, right? Corruption and reforms not coming quick enough. There is a legitimate opposition in Syria, and it's where you would expect it to be. It's operating in the political sphere. They have members elected to parliament. They have organizations. What the U.S. is calling opposition is not the opposition. It's Western-backed terrorists. So I just wanted to make sure I reiterated that I didn't see a single Syrian that had anything good to say about these so-called rebels. Not a single one.
Incredibly insightful again, man. So one of the most interesting things that you told me when you came back was that, well, you also said that the people at the airport was it New Jersey? Yeah, it was New Jersey, wasn't it?
It was New Jersey, yeah. It was.
So I want to ask you now about, maybe you can just mention how the people in New Jersey were so much less polite than the people in Syria. And you said that the food, readjusting to American food, made you a little bit sick. And you said some very interesting things about the health of people in Lebanon. And I believe there's no fluoride in the water, no chemtrails, nothing like that.
I don't know about the fluoride, but I didn't see a single chemtrail the whole time I was there, which was quite nice. The experience of coming back from how I described the people that I met there, and then I came back through London, and people are pretty nice in London, and then my re-entry to the United States, which is always unpleasant, but to come back to the United States in Newark, New Jersey, that is an experience no person should ever have to go through. That is the worst airport I've ever been through. I mean, the level of rudeness is unparalleled. Kind of like I've never been anywhere where people are
Chicago Midway Airport.
I have to say I think Newark is the worst. But the police state measures. I mean, when you come back, when you go to Lebanon, right? And Lebanon has legitimate terrorism. There are legitimate terrorist attacks. I mean, in Tripoli, which is not far from Beirut, actually, there are ISIS fighters there. If you go out, several miles, maybe 45 minutes to an hour out, you can go into areas that the ISIS fighters had crossed over the border into Lebanon. So they're in Lebanon too. So they have legitimate terror. And then, of course, the Israelis on the southern border. They have reasons to worry about people coming through the border undocumented or with weapons and so forth. They're polite. They ask you questions, you answer the questions. If they need to check a bag, they politely ask you to check a bag. If you have to have an interaction with the armed guards, they interact with you. It's fairly polite. When you come back to the United States, it's immediately like entering into a prison. And this is something people really need to experience for themselves. It sounds on one level, on an intellectual level, like, okay, it makes sense. The United States has dissolved into authoritarianism, but go outside of the U.S. for about 2 weeks, calm down a bit from the frantic, energy of the U.S., and then come back through any airport, not just Newark, any airport. And as soon as you get off the plane, actually, as soon as you get on the plane, the flight attendants aren't nearly as polite or as organized. But as soon as you get off the plane, you're going to have orders barked at you. You're going to be treated as if you're being processed into some type of prison camp, right? You have somebody standing there waving people back, just repeating the same lines over and over. You will go to this line. You will remove your shoes, place them in the basket. This is not something that you had in Lebanon, right? I mean, people were actually kind of quiet, and the energy was, the energy and tension was a lot lower in a place where there's legitimate terrorism. And in the United States, we're being screamed at like we're entering a prison. And which is reinforced by the fact that you basically have to disrobe, take your shoes off, your belt off, and take everything out of your pockets, and then get aggressively searched by people who really shouldn't have any access to a badge. But that's how you're greeted in coming into the country. I've done this a few times, and it's always the same, although it's getting worse.
Yeah, definitely. So, what can you say about the health and the diet of the people of Lebanon and Syria? And do you think that the lack of poison, the lack of harmful chemicals, the better nutrition, everything like that, do you think that contributed to their positive attitude? Because it seems to me that a major factor in the reasons why people have a shitty attitude in America and in places like this, one factor out of many, is that they don't feel chemically right. They don't feel healthy, and that can make you irritable, depressed. That's only one factor. You know, there's a culture of rudeness in many places in America, but how did you notice the differences between the two places like that?
It was a drastic difference. Their diet is mainly Mediterranean diet. As you go east in Syria, it becomes a little different, but Syrian cuisine's largely the same. Their food is mostly, overwhelmingly, non-GMO, mostly not processed, fresh, and organic, which is what, those are what we call it, what the Syrians and Lebanese call it is food, right? We call it organic, 100% non-GMO. They just call it food. And you can go, anywhere, whether it's street food or a nice restaurant, and the color of the food, I've got pictures I can show you of some of the food, and whether it's a salad, it looks like the brightest, most colorful salad you'll ever eat. The sandwiches you can get on the street are just erupting with flavor. I mean, it's hard. The best sandwiches I've ever had. And some of them would just be basic, like falafel sandwiches. That's not something that's usually bursting with flavor, but it did over there. And all this stuff is made with fresh ingredients. And you can tell obesity, largely non-existent. And if somebody was obese, it wasn't grotesquely obese. It was just fat, and they were fat because they ate a lot. And a lot. I mean, I personally took advantage of the cheap prices, and I gorged myself on food, and I lost weight. Food, when you eat lunch, you don't feel like you need to go lay down and take a nap. You feel energized. That's something I don't think most Americans understand, that after you eat a good meal, you're supposed to feel like going out and doing more labor or getting back to work. You're not supposed to feel like you should go lie down and take a nap. Well, this is how we felt. We ate and it energized us. And fresh vegetables on the table. And the taste, again, out of this world. It was great.
It was cheaper. It was better, more flavorful. How do you feel about? I've come to believe that, you see those memes on Facebook about the fluoride look in people's eyes, and sometimes it seems a little cheesy to say that there's a fluoride look in someone's eye, but that's real.
It is real, and there's a real comparison, because when you see the people over there, they're full of life, right? Even if they're not moving, they're full of life. They look awake. You can look in their eyes. They look, alive. There's something going on there, and especially when you come back to the United States. See, we acclimate to all this stuff. We think it's normal to look and to feel like a zombie and all that. But when you come back to the U.S., you're struck by how many people are just so incredibly, not just obese, but sickly.
Sickly, that's the right word.
I mean, people who are in their 20s and 30s and 40s who should be in fairly decent shape, should feel active and look active, are waddling. You know, they're just waddling past you. It looks like they're, you know, not able to walk properly. They're obese. You look in their eyes, they just look like people who are unhealthy and that, like, they're sick and that they're struggling to make it through the rest of the trip, or struggling to make it through the workday. And you can see it in their eyes. In fact, the Syrians, some of the people that I talk to, and, you know, some of my friends in Syria will tell you that they notice that with people from the West, particularly the United States, but even from England and some other countries, but especially the United States, that when people come over to Syria, they notice that it's not like people from Syria and Lebanon and Iraq, Iran. It's not like Russia. It's distinct to them. It looks like they're sick, like they're ill, like they're tired, and just like there's nothing there, like they're not alive. And, you know, it's not because they're not conscious human beings. It's because they are struggling just to function, you know, on a physical level and a mental level.
I feel like I feel like that is just so important to note and let it be known how drastic the difference is. That's just, it's so important. You can't have mindfulness and consciousness without having every nutrient our body needs to produce, you know, everything our body needs and everything like that. So that's incredibly insightful.
Yeah, I mean, again, the moment you step off the plane, you notice it. And the incredible level of sickness that you see in people here back in the United States. It's amazing that people can function the way we do, at the level that we do. I mean, we are an overworked country. I mean, we are some of the hardest workers. We have no choice. But it's amazing that people can be hard workers in the shape that they're in. Everybody looks tired. Everybody looks sick. And I didn't even mention my first reentry meal. I managed to get some food that I actually like, and I noticed immediately that the taste was not what I thought it should be, you know, compared to what I had. A little sandwich in the Middle East was an amazing experience. When I came back, this big sandwich that I really wanted to have didn't have the taste and did not sit well with me. For 3 or 4 days, I could barely eat anything. I was sick. I could eat just maybe a quarter of my food without wanting to throw up. And it went on for 3 or 4 days, and I wasn't sick from the trip or from the other country. I was sick because I was reacclimating to toxic crap that we call food, that passes for food. I'm acclimated now, but the 3 or 4 days when I came back was pretty rough.
Wow. Well, you've just done a service to everyone for going there and being able to get that experience that we need to articulate and figure out how to get out to people. So I appreciate you coming on and speaking so that we can take your experience and put it into a format that will spread this understanding to people. You know, I'm going to make the headline for 2 videos from this interview and clearly put the substance into that, so people, even if they don't read the description of this interview or listen to it, the headline alone could solidify in their minds, you know, this kind of understanding that you just that you just brought to us with your experience. So
if I could add just one more thing that I didn't mention earlier, the idea of religion in the Middle East. This is something, again, that Americans and Westerners have a really biased view of, because they're constantly shown pictures of Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and that is then presented as if that represents everybody in the Middle East, that everybody's a religious fanatic and they've been fighting for 1,000 years, and all that kind of stuff. Well, first I would ask, what about the last 1,000 years of European history? If we're talking about people who are launching wars. Last time I checked, Europe started 2 world wars and have been fighting ever since boundaries were established there. So it's not really fair to blame the Middle East for fighting the occasional war. But the question of religion, if you talk to people in Syria, if you ask them, what are you? The answer you're going to get back is not a Christian. It's not a Muslim, not a Jew, not a Druze. The answer is going to be, I'm Syrian. And that's going to be that. Because they don't view themselves as religion first, country second. They view themselves as Syrian. And if then you can get into the question of religion. And you could talk to people for hours, and if you didn't bring up the subject, you wouldn't know, were they Christian, were they Muslim, because it's a country that's secular, right? Now, I mean, obviously you can tell if somebody's a Christian or a Muslim if you talk to them hours and pay attention to what they're saying and manners of dress sometimes, but it's not something that is at the forefront as much as the United States and the American people think it is. It's kind of, I keep, when I discuss situations in the U.S. and the Middle East, it's almost like religion is like race here in the United States. And up until the last 8 years or so, if you ask people in the United States, what are you, you would get an American. It's changing now because our powers that be are trying to divide people and provoke them to fight more and more. But it's something that is a part of you, but it's not the main part of you. And this is the way it was in Syria. It's a secular country, and that's the way they want to keep it. Whether they're Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Druze, whatever, they want to keep their secular country. And the way it's being portrayed in the West is not accurate at all.
Absolutely. Well, I think that just about wraps it up. Thank you very much for your time, brother, and thank you for every contribution you make to every website, to your own website, to Era of Wisdom. Thank you for your contributions and effort. Much love.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely, brother. Peace.
Yeah, we have a wonderful guest tonight, Brandon Turbeville. We're going to, do you remember the Peter Finch character in the movie Network? The guy who loses it, and rightfully so, and declares, I'm mad as hell and not going to take it anymore? Well, this baby boomer has reached the end of my rope as well. I mean, I literally cannot channel surf on the boob tube without realizing that this whole country is mesmerized by the baloney thrown to us via the mainstream media. If you want a more cerebral way to enjoy the airwaves, then you can go to the so-called news talk shows, or actual, what they define as, news shows. What you actually get is either some young cookie-cutter attractive male or female model, a.k.a. journalist, who has been indoctrinated with the mindset that America, with a K, is either Republican or Democrat, or red state or blue state. Any other point of view or political understanding is out of the question. This time around, it's either Trump or Clinton for us minions out there. Since Trump makes good news copy, I wager that you cannot stay on the so-called news channels, CNN, MSNBC, Fox, to name a few, without hearing the name Trump at least every 1 or 2 minutes. The issues these channels cover are always the hot-button ones about gay marriage, gun control, immigration, and never what the working stiffs need to be informed about. Insufficient health and dental coverage, our bloated military spending and phony wars, are becoming a part-time work society with no benefits at all. Question: when did any of you out there last see or hear a show about those 3 or aforementioned issues? How many of you have actually been financially wounded by poor health or dental coverage? How many of you out there even realize that over half of our discretionary federal government spending, your tax dollars, goes to military spending? Over half. How many of you out there have jobs that are technically part-time with little or no benefits? The boob tube and radio waves will never inform or allow debate on these things. By the way, there are two other legitimate parties running candidates for our highest office, the Green Party and the Libertarian Party. Anyway, from the ridiculous robo-phone calls we all receive on a variety of baloney services and issues and candidates, more of us should finally see the light. We are living here in America with a K under the auspices of a highly tuned military-industrial empire that relies on you, John and Joan Q. Public, to remain narcotized by consumerism and tabloid-style dribble. The Pogo comic strip was correct. We have met the enemy, and he be us. Now let's get to our interview with the very scholarly Brandon Turbeville. Brandon is a writer based out of South Carolina. He is the author of 7 books. The one that we're going to focus on tonight is The Road to Damascus, the Anglo-American Assault on Syria. He's a staff writer for Activist Post and has published over 850 articles dealing with a wide variety of subjects. I caught 1 or 2 of his articles on Information Clearinghouse, and that's why I got in touch with him. He has been a guest on numerous alternative media broadcasts as well as mainstream outlets, and his books can be found in the bookstore at brandonturbeville.com, falseflagpublications.blogsport.com, thebookpatch.com, and Amazon.com. Brandon is also the host of a Truth on the Tracks, a weekly news roundup that serves as a hub for activists, information, and solutions. Truth on the Tracks airs every Monday and Friday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on ucy.tv/TT. Brandon, good evening.
Hey, Phillip. Thanks for having me on.
Okay, good to have you, and let's get right to the crux of matters. Let's talk about Syria and the Middle East. Can you maybe give our listeners here just a brief overview in your own mind or an estimation as to what's the recent history in your point of view to Syria?
Well, I think what people need to really understand when it comes to what's happening in Syria and what's been happening for the last 5 years is that this is not a civil war. It's being presented in the mainstream media as a civil war between moderate rebels and a brutal dictator and ISIS fighters happening to find their way into the midst, and the U.S. is trying to protect civilians, etc. This is virtually all of that is absolutely false. The beginning of this crisis has been long in the making, but if one wants to go back and look and see the beginning of the full-scale, the all-out assault, you could go back to 2011. This is traditionally in the mainstream. This destabilization was ascribed to the Arab Spring, right, that propped up all across the Arab world in 2011. The Arab Spring itself was nothing more than a Western-backed color revolution. And what I mean by that is it was completely funded by the United States government, the U.S. State Department specifically, Western-backed NGOs, Soros-backed organizations, etc. And they go into these countries, they stir up protest movements. Some of them have legitimate complaints, others do not. But they tend to prey on the unemployed, on the youth, people who are essentially hopeless. They don't have any prospects in terms of jobs, in terms of economics, in terms of the future in their country, or they're simply for hire. And then they pay these individuals, they organize them, and use them as a battering ram against the countries that they want to destabilize. Now, this happened in Egypt, this happened in Tunisia, this happened in Syria, it happened in Libya, and in a couple of other places as well. This is nothing new. It's happened in Eastern Europe before, but we won't digress too much. Essentially what happened in 2011 was that these alleged protests, and I say alleged protests because these were never really protests. In 2011, the mainstream will tell you it began as a peaceful protest and then dissolved into what we see today. But it was never peaceful. From the get-go, it was violent. the alleged protesters were on rooftops sniping at men, women, and children on their way to work, school, the hospital, and whatever, shooting at security forces, killing security forces, killing and attacking the Syrian military. And in fact, if you would have talked to the Syrian people early on, the complaints were not that Assad was a brutal dictator. It's that he wasn't cracking down enough on these protesters, right? Is back in 2011 this is not a civil war, it's a proxy war. The so-called rebels, the so-called activists in Syria are entirely Western-backed, Western-supported, Western-created in order to destroy and destabilize the Syrian government.
Okay, question. So Brandon, why do you think the U.S. Wanted to destroy and destabilize Syria, for instance?
Well, there's a number of reasons, and just to put it most simplistically at first, is that it stood in terms of resistance toward the American establishment, essentially their agenda. Syria was a holdout. It was not engaging in the privatization of its national bank, for instance. It was not going along with the anti-Russian, anti-Iranian agenda coming from NATO, for instance, that as well. And there were questions over a pipeline that was going to be coming from Iran versus coming from from Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. And Syria nixed the Gulf pipeline in favor of the Iranian pipelines. You see the resistance there as well. So essentially it's what the West or NATO, specifically the United States, would call a rogue nation simply because it's not willing to go along with private central banks, austerity, and of course geopolitical pivoting against Russia, against a number of other countries as well. And of course the ever-present hostility to Israel, which also is a cause for the hostility of the United States.
But when you mention all these things, now first of all, so Mubarak wasn't he supposed to be our guy in Egypt? I know he was a brutal dictator, but was he our guy? But yet they still instigated this Arab Spring to overthrow him, right?
Right. He was our guy for many years, right, for decades. And there actually came a time when Mubarak, who by any reasonable standards would have been considered still our guy, but he began to pull away to some degree, not to any massive degree, but to pull away from Western agenda, platform points, I guess you would say. And toward the end there, he was simply overthrown. He was. These guys tend to be, able to be thrown away at the last minute. And then of course Morsi, which was the Muslim Brotherhood choice, was put in his place. But yeah, these guys are disposable. Mubarak,
like Noriega. So like Noriega was in Panama, back in the
right.
late '80s. Yeah. Okay, so we know a lot of people should know about Libya. What I was reading, I think you might have written it to yourself, but Gaddafi was against the Africa man. Is that what it's called? He was against the Africa man that NATO was trying to do.
Right. He was, again, this is another example. This was somebody who did not have the private central bank. This was somebody who was not willing to allow the IMF and other, NATO supported, I know that's United Nations, but still it's Anglo-American centric organizations to come in and loot the wealth of the Libyan people. They have all of this wealth. I mean, a lot of people don't understand how the oil wealth coming out of Libya was applied to society. It was a country that had the highest living standards in Africa, and there were the goals were on the part of the West was to come in and to privatize all that. And
okay, let's say that again for people that don't know. until now, what you're talking about, the highest standard of living in that region, right?
The highest standard of living in the entire continent of Africa, right?
The entire continent of Africa, okay. And he also wanted to join together with other African nations and form their own currency, right?
Yes, I don't remember what the name of the currency would have been, but this was his idea was a type of Pan-Africanism, uniting of African countries.
Right. So he had to go. All right. So, and they got rid of him, and Mrs. Clinton made the famous remark, which we all know about. So they got rid of him, and they got rid of other people, but they had to get rid of Assad. Is he the last? I mean, of those smaller countries. Obviously, Iran is a big country. So is he the last of all the smaller countries that we have not controlled yet?
Yeah, and you get countries, Venezuela, and then of course.
Right, but in that region I'm talking about.
Yeah, he would be the last. Lebanon is always one of those countries that could go either way. Lebanon's always teetering on the brink of total destabilization simply because of the confessional system. But and the next step is Iran. And then, of course, I would really warn people to look out after Iran. The next step is Russia, and that's very concerning.
So all right. So now tell us about. So we have this thing down for everyone who's been listening. You've been laying it out really well. So that's a situation of why we wanted to go into Syria. Now, tell us about this, the formation of this ISIS or ISIL, whatever they keep changing the name, whatever. So tell us about that.
Yeah, well, that's sort of you sort of answered your own question there because it's a name change, and that people can get easily confused because we hear moderate rebels, the Free Syrian Army, the SDF, and then you hear Al Qaeda, Al Nusra. And then I think it's I can't even remember the name of the new version of Al Nusra, but then you hear ISIS and ISIL and all that kind of stuff, and people tend to think that these are different organizations. Now, at the very lower levels, some of these groups do indeed fight one another because they are made up of legitimate fanatics, and this is the nature of a fanatic, right? If you happen to wear a tie on a Wednesday, then you're sinning against God and you have to be killed. But at the higher these are not just merely fanatics. These are essentially controlled by Western intelligence agencies, by NATO intelligence agencies, and so forth. And what the most simple way to realize what these people are, right? You can look at when we went into Iraq in 2003. We had the development of Al Qaeda organizations. One was called Al Qaeda in Iraq, and that was the Iraqi version of Al Qaeda. And then in Syria, we had Al Qaeda in Syria, but they called themselves Al Nusra. Now, eventually, there was a public merger between the two, and they called themselves the Islamic Emirate of Iraq and the Levant. That's IEIL. That name was then changed to the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant.
Ah, interesting.
We got
so
ISIS,
it was a merger.
Right, and of course Daesh is just sort of a derogatory way to refer to them, but it's the same groups, and they can say, well, Nusra has broken away from ISIS, and then Al Qaeda has, eschewed ISIS, and then all of this, but it's the same group. It's legitimate. It's literally the same group with a different name. Of course, Nusra has now changed its name to something else. It doesn't matter. These names
doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Now. So, and these are mostly Sunni, right? These people, they're mostly Sunni.
All Sunni, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So then you have Saudi Arabia, which is Wahhabi, which is Sunni, though. So they are what? They are funding, or they have been funding this ISIL.
Well, there's a number of countries that have been doing this. Saudi Arabia has been the one that's been the most open, or at least the least concerned about being, exposed for doing this. Saudi Arabia has provided a lot of the manpower. They've also provided a lot of the weaponry, which has been funneled from the U.S. So don't make a mistake. It's not just Saudi Arabia. That's not the head of the snake. the United States is actually providing ISIS with weapons, and it is coming through Saudi Arabia. Right? We've openly admitted that the U.S. is giving money and weapons to these so-called rebels. They are the same thing as ISIS, and it's coming through Saudi Arabia. Turkey is another country that has aided in the creation and the training and the facilitation of ISIS coming in from the Turkish border into Syria. Jordan has been used as a staging ground for the training of ISIS. In fact, a lot of what has been officially called ISIS, that sort of surge of jihadist fighters that came a couple of years ago, those fighters came off of training bases in Jordan. That's when we started the name ISIS being thrown around. Israel, of course, is another. Israel has been repeatedly videotaped giving aid to ISIS fighters and terrorists in Syria for the purpose of facilitating their attacks inside the country. And of course, it's not just Saudi Arabia in the Gulf either. We have Qatar, the other Gulf states who are supporting, even Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, who are supporting these fighters as well. But I would caution people not to look at Saudi Arabia as the head of the snake here, because this is a Western-backed policy. This is a NATO policy, particularly the United States, Britain, and France, the most bloodthirsty of that grouping.
But why, Brandon? Is it because all these countries are Sunni? Is that really the basis? I mean, I'm not talking about the outside forces, the Western NATO countries, the United States forces, and the Israeli forces, but the actual countries that you mentioned. Is it because they're all Sunni that they're doing this?
Well, Saudi Arabia is held together through religious extremism, and that the Saudi royal family, they can profess Sunni Islam all they want, but these guys are degenerates. They're certainly not pious people, but it's used. That brand of religion is used in order to facilitate this type of terrorism. It's not a religious war. That's something else I would like to mention here. I hear a lot of people, when you talk about Syria, you get the knee-jerk response. So, they've been fighting for 1,000 years, right? But this is not true, right? Syria was the safest country in the Middle East, and one of the most diverse and tolerant places. In fact, it is the most diverse and tolerant places in the Middle East. But the Saudi brand of Wahhabism, which has been used to control the Saudi people for so many years in this theocracy, is also being used to stir up and control these fundamentalists coming from the deserts of Saudi Arabia, and of course even coming from Libya as well, and other African countries and Middle Eastern countries, where they're pulling them in and using Wahhabism to unify them under a certain banner.
Okay.
Now, keep in mind,
yeah, go ahead.
The people that they're killing. So it's not just Sunnis attacking Shiites or attacking Alawites. This is Sunnis, meaning ISIS and the Saudi and American-funded terrorists, attacking Sunnis, right?
Really?
They killed Sunni. Yeah, the Syrian people are Christian, Sunni, Shiite, Alawite. It's a very diverse mix. There's Kurds there too, and Druze. There's all kinds of religions there in Syria. And the ISIS terrorists, the FSA, all of them have been killing Sunnis, Shiites alike. There is no.
So Brandon, why is it?
This is Ozzy Skateboard, and you're listening to UCY.TV.